All right, today we are diving into a book that's really been making waves. It's a pretty dense and, frankly, polemical critique, but we're going to unpack its central arguments piece by piece. Let's get right into it. So, the book is called Ten Heads of Ravana, a critique of Hindu-phobic scholars. Now, just to be super clear, our goal here isn't to pick a side at all. We're simply going to explain the arguments that are presented within the book itself. Our job is to understand its core claims. So, here's our game plan. First, we're going to get a handle on the book's main metaphor. Then, we'll dive into 3 key historical debates that it gets into. And finally, we'll wrap it all up by looking at the book's central argument and what it's really calling for. Okay, so first things first, the title. Why Ravana? Well, the book's entire argument is built around this very powerful and you could say provocative metaphor. You really have to understand it to get what comes next. Well, the book comes up with this term, intellectual Ravana, and you gotta understand it's meant to be a kind of parody. The comparison they're drawing is this. Just like the mythological Ravana is known for disrupting society and sacred rituals, the book claims that these 10 modern scholars are disrupting and distorting the academic study of India. And this quote from the intro really tells you everything. The authors aren't just, dismissing these scholars as clueless. It's actually the opposite. They're emphasizing just how intelligent and powerful they are in today's academic world. The whole point is to frame them as serious, influential figures whose ideas need to be taken seriously and challenged head-on. Okay, with that metaphor in mind, let's jump into the first major theme the book tackles, how the history of Islamic rule in India is written. Now, this is a super contentious field of history, and the book dives right into the thick of it. So, the book's big claim here is that some historians, especially those it describes as Marxists, tend to explain away the actions of medieval rulers by focusing on things like politics or economics instead of religion. And the book argues that this approach ends up seriously downplaying the actual destructive impact of what happened. And this is where it gets really specific. The book zooms in on the work of the famous historian Ramala Thapar in her analysis of Mahmud of Ghazni's raid on the Somanatha temple. The book says her view is that his primary motive was economic, literally his greed for gold. But then, as a rebuttal, the book brings up a source from much closer to that time, the historian Ibn al-Athir, who wrote that Ghazni's motive was explicitly religious. He wanted to destroy this idol. All right, so from political history, the book shifts gears and turns its attention to religious texts. The next big critique is all about the scholarship surrounding some of Hinduism's most foundational epics, like the Ramayana. The argument here essentially is that certain academic methods end up casting doubt on the authenticity and, the traditional understanding of these foundational texts. The book claims that this kind of scholarship tries to impose foreign theories that just don't fit, and in doing so, it challenges how these works have been understood for centuries. And here's another great example of how the book makes its case. It points to a theory it attributes to Thapar, which suggests that the very first and very last books of the Ramayana weren't original, but were added later to Brahmanize the story. But the book's rebuttal is pretty interesting. It points to the 1st century Buddhist philosopher Ashwagosha and argues that his own writings show he knew about events from those exact books long before they were supposedly added. So the critique is getting bigger, right? It's moving from specific texts to the very idea of India itself. And this all builds up to one of the book's most fundamental arguments, which is all about the debate over Indian nationalism. And what we have here is a real clash of ideas. On one hand, you have the common academic view that the idea of an Indian nation is pretty modern, something that came out of the 19th century and British colonialism. But the book pushes back on this hard. It argues that even if the political state was often divided, there was a deep-rooted, unified civilizational identity that existed for ages. And this slide lays it out perfectly. The book highlights the scholarly take that Indian nationalism is a modern invention. And then, in response, it points to ancient texts. It argues that works like the Puranas and Kautilya's Arthashastra already described a unified cultural and geographical land called Bharatavarsha, which suggests a much, much older idea of a single civilization. Okay, so we've looked at these specific examples, history, texts, the idea of a nation, but what's the common thread here? What's the bigger picture the book is trying to paint with all these different critiques? And that question brings us right to the heart of it, the book's central argument. Because this isn't just about pointing out flaws, it's about proposing a whole new way of doing things. a kind of revolution in how Indian civilization is studied. So the book basically breaks down its main argument into 3 simple steps. First, it claims that the academic study of India, or Indiology, has been dominated by Western institutions for the last 2 centuries. Second, it argues that these institutions use foreign methods and theories that don't really fit, and they end up misrepresenting Indian traditions. And so third, it proposes a solution, what it calls Swadeshi Indiology, a homegrown approach to studying India from the inside, using its own traditional Dharmic ways of thinking. And really, that leaves us with the big, fundamental question that this book puts on the table. It goes way beyond historical debates, doesn't it? It's really asking something much more profound. Who gets to tell a civilization's story, and what are the right tools to use when you tell it?